Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Daniel stared at the bank statement on his laptop screen, his eyes narrowing as he traced the suspicious payment listed. It was from a hotel, made at midnight, just a few days ago, the exact night Sarah had claimed she'd been helping an old friend through a tough time. His hand hovered over the mouse, scrolling up and down, as if repeated glances might reveal an explanation he had somehow missed. But there it was, the irrefutable charge, sitting boldly between their regular expenses. He could feel his chest tighten, a mix of anger and disbelief creeping in. The familiar warmth of their home seemed almost mocking now, its calmness underscoring the growing tension in his mind. The quietness of the place felt sharp, as if the walls themselves were waiting, too, for Sarah to walk through the door and unravel her story. He shut the laptop with a controlled motion, folding his hands in front of him. Daniel wasn't one for quick judgments. He had trusted Sarah deeply, always valuing honesty as the foundation of their marriage. But now, as doubt slithered into his thoughts, he knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. When Sarah walked through the front door, she barely noticed Daniel sitting at the dining table, his face partially hidden by shadows. Her usual cheerful greeting was absent, and she seemed lost in thought, unaware of the charged silence that enveloped the room. Daniel's gaze followed her as she moved through the house, dropping her bag by the entrance and shrugging off her coat. Her casualness struck him as oddly dissonant, almost careless, given what he now knew. "Sarah," he called, his voice steady but holding a note that made her pause. She turned, eyes slightly widening as she took in his posture and the intensity of his gaze.
"Hey, honey," she began, a forced smile flickering across her face. "Everything okay?"
He motioned to the seat across from him, his hand calm and deliberate. "I think we need to talk." The hesitation in her step was subtle, but he caught it, and she made her way over, taking a seat without breaking eye contact. She still didn't seem to sense the gravity of the moment, or perhaps she was hoping to mask whatever anxiety she might have felt. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice light, a touch too casual. Daniel opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her, pointing to the hotel charge. "I was looking at our bank statement earlier and I found this. I think you know what it is." Her eyes scanned the line item, and he saw a flicker of something, a momentary panic, swiftly replaced by what looked like resolve. "Oh, that," she said, shrugging. "I told you I was helping an old friend. I stayed with them for a while, just to make sure they were okay." Her response was smooth, rehearsed, as if she'd already prepared an answer for this exact question. But her words didn't sit right with him. It was a vague explanation, too convenient and lacking in the detail he would have expected if it were the truth. Daniel folded his arms, his voice quiet yet firm. "You said you were helping an old friend. So why a hotel? And why didn't you tell me at the time?" "I would have understood if it were an emergency, Sarah. I would have been there for you if you'd asked." She let out a light laugh, a forced attempt to brush off the question. "Daniel, you're overthinking it. My friend, he wasn't in a good place, and the hotel was just a convenient place to talk privately." "He." Daniel's eyebrows lifted, his tone steady but piercing. Sarah hesitated, the briefest pause before she continued. "Yes, he. I didn't tell you before because, well, you know how you can be a little jealous sometimes. I didn't want you to worry over nothing." The word jealous hit a nerve, and Daniel felt his jaw clench. "If there was nothing to worry about, Sarah, you wouldn't be hiding this from me. You'd have told me everything. Instead, I had to find out through a bank statement." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her posture defensive. "Are you really accusing me of something here, Daniel?" He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not accusing you, Sarah. I'm giving you a chance to tell me the truth. Because right now, all I see is a story full of holes in a bank charge that doesn't add up." For a moment, she looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of defiance and something else, guilt, perhaps, or shame. But she kept her composure, straightening her shoulders as she spoke. "Daniel, I don't know what you're trying to say here, but this is ridiculous. You're making something out of nothing." But as her words faded into the tense quiet of the room, Daniel could feel the last strands of his trust beginning to unravel. And he knew, as he looked at her, that he couldn't let this lie go. The truth was slipping through, and he would get to it, no matter what it took. Daniel sat back, his eyes never leaving Sarah's, the tension thickening as he waited for her next move. She'd always been good at covering her tracks, little white lies, half-truths when it suited her. But this time, her cover was wearing thin, and he could see her struggling to hold it together. A bead of sweat formed at her temple, though she attempted to maintain her usual calm demeanor. She was scrambling, trying to calculate what she could say that might pacify him. but Daniel's silence only fueled her anxiety. "Daniel," she began, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "I told you everything there is to tell. I don't understand why you're making this into such a big deal." "Because it is a big deal, Sarah." His tone was firmer, tinged with frustration. "We've been married for years, and you've never kept something like this from me. Why would you? And why this strange secrecy about a friend? You never mentioned anyone needing this kind of help before. Who is this man, really?" Her eyes darted to the table, avoiding his gaze. "He's just someone I knew a long time ago," she replied, a hint of defensiveness slipping into her voice. "We ran into each other by accident, and he was going through a rough time. I didn't want to just turn my back on him." Daniel's patience was fraying. "I'm not upset that you helped a friend, Sarah. I'm upset because you felt the need to hide it from me and lie about it. It's not adding up. If it was innocent, you wouldn't have needed to go to a hotel, and you wouldn't be giving me such vague answers now." Sarah shifted in her chair, her fingers tracing small circles on the table's surface as if seeking comfort from the familiar wood. But Daniel could see the cracks forming in her armor. The confident, dismissive front she'd tried to maintain was slipping. Her hands trembled slightly, and her breathing quickened. "I didn't want you to misunderstand," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want you to think that something was going on when there wasn't. I knew how it'd look." His gaze hardened, his disappointment palpable. "So instead of being honest, you chose to hide it. You let me stumble upon this by chance, assuming I wouldn't find out. Do you know how that makes me feel, Sarah?" She looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. "I was afraid, Daniel. Afraid that you wouldn't understand, that you'd react exactly like this." He shook his head slowly, his voice edged with bitterness. "Do you hear yourself? I'm not angry because you helped a friend, I'm angry because you lied. You chose secrecy over trust. And now I can't help but wonder what else you've hidden from me." Her face paled, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was as though the weight of her actions had finally sunk in. In that silence, Daniel could sense her calculating her next move, wondering how much she knew and how much she could still control. Finally, she leaned forward, her hands reaching out to clasp his. "Please, Daniel," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Let's put this behind us. It was a mistake. I handled it poorly, but I swear it was nothing more." Daniel stared down at her hands, her fingers gripping his with desperation. For a moment he softened, nearly giving in to her plea. But then the image of the hotel charge burned into his mind again, a stark reminder of the dishonesty lying between them. He gently pulled his hands back, steeling himself. "Sarah, I need more than words. If it was really nothing, then you should have no problem proving it. But if you can't do that, if you're not willing to be completely honest with me, I don't see how we move forward." Her hands fell limply to her sides, and a defeated look washed over her face. Daniel's resolve hardened as he rose from his seat, the heavy finality of his words hanging in the air. She sat in silence, watching him, perhaps realizing that her usual excuses and evasions wouldn't work this time. The truth was on the edge, close to spilling, and Daniel was determined to see it all, no matter how much it hurt. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Daniel stood, his eyes steady and unyielding as he looked down at Sarah, who remained seated, visibly shaken. For once, her confidence had deserted her, leaving behind only an anxious woman struggling to regain control of a situation slipping through her fingers. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice shaky but attempting to find some resolve. "Daniel, I know this looks bad," she said, almost in a whisper, "but I need you to believe me. There's nothing more to this than I've told you. It was just one night, just a friend who needed me. It didn't mean anything." Her words rang hollow, the emptiness of her defense only deepening Daniel's sense of betrayal. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to shout, to release the growing frustration within him. He wanted to believe her. For years he had trusted her implicitly, never once doubting her loyalty. But the lie, so carefully woven and concealed, had shattered that faith, and now he found himself questioning every piece of their relationship. "Sarah," he said slowly, each word heavy with disappointment, "if it truly was innocent, then why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you think I could handle it? That's what hurts the most, you didn't trust me enough to be honest." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What else haven't you told me?" Her eyes dropped, unable to meet his, and her hands twisted in her lap. The guilt was unmistakable now, seeping through the cracks of her controlled exterior. She took a deep breath, exhaling shakily as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "All right," she admitted softly, maybe I wasn't completely truthful." She paused, watching his face for any sign of softening, but his expression remained cold, demanding full transparency. He was more than just a friend once. Years ago, we were close. Daniel's heart sank, the air heavy with the implications of her words. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her confession, each detail adding weight to the betrayal he was beginning to feel more deeply. The lie wasn't just about a single night, it was about an entire chapter of her life she had concealed, one that she had deliberately reopened without him. "And you decided that one night at a hotel with him was justifiable?" he asked, his voice barely containing his hurt and disbelief. "You rekindled a relationship I knew nothing about, thinking I wouldn't find out." Her face twisted with regret, a tear slipping down her cheek as she shook her head. "No, Daniel, I swear it wasn't like that. I didn't plan anything. He reached out, he was in a dark place, I just wanted to help." He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly as he processed her words, the enormity of the situation settling over him. "And you never thought that helping him would hurt us?" His voice was low, his anger tempered with sadness. "You went to him alone, you lied about it, and now you're sitting here, expecting me to understand." Her tears came faster now, her voice breaking as she tried to hold herself together. "Daniel, please," she pleaded. "I was wrong, I know that. I didn't think it through. I should have told you, God, I should have told you everything. But please don't let this ruin what we have. I love you, and I need you to believe that." Daniel's gaze softened briefly, the love he had for her flickering in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by the doubt and hurt that had been stirred awake. "Love?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You say you love me, but every action says the opposite. Love isn't lies, Sarah. It isn't deceit. It's honesty, and right now, I don't know if I can trust a word you say." She dropped her head, defeated, the weight of his disappointment hanging heavy in the room. The realization was dawning on her that no matter how many explanations she offered, no matter how many apologies she gave, the damage was done. The truth she had concealed had unraveled their foundation, casting doubt over every shared moment, every word spoken in trust. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words hollow, knowing they could do little to repair what had been broken. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her voice small and desperate. "Please tell me there's a way to fix this. I'll do anything, Daniel. Just don't give up on us." He watched her, the love he once felt now burdened by the undeniable ache of betrayal. For a moment, he considered the life they'd built, the years shared, and the thought of throwing it all away felt like tearing apart his own soul. But as he stood there, seeing the truth written in her defeated posture, he knew that forgiveness would not come easily, and that maybe, just maybe, it would never come at all. Daniel paced back and forth in the dimly lit living room, his thoughts churning. The air between him and Sarah was thick with unspoken words, as if even the walls bore witness to the betrayal that hung heavy in the space between them. Sarah watched him, her tear-streaked face a picture of regret, desperation evident in her gaze. She seemed to want to reach out, to bridge the distance. But he kept his arms folded, a physical barrier as much as an emotional one. "What do you have any idea what this feels like, Sarah?" He finally spoke, his voice hollow yet piercing. "To find out that everything I trusted in, everything I believed was just a facade, eh?" He stopped, meeting her gaze, his expression haunted. "I believed in us. I believed in you." She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel, I didn't mean to hurt you. I never thought it would come to this. It was a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake." "A mistake?" He scoffed, shaking his head as if the word itself were a betrayal. "Mistakes are accidents. This was a choice, Sarah. Every lie you told, every detail you concealed, those were choices you made."
Sarah bit her lip, reaching out her hand, but he took a step back. The hurt in his eyes cut through her, and for the first time she realized that she might have gone too far, that she might have underestimated the strength of his trust in her and the impact of its loss.
"I thought we had a marriage built on honesty, on mutual respect," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But now I'm standing here wondering if I ever really knew you at all." Her mouth opened, a rebuttal ready, but the words seemed to falter on her lips. She glanced down, as if the floor might hold some answer, some guidance on what to say next, but she found none. "Daniel," she murmured, "I know you're angry. I know I broke your trust. But please, don't throw everything away because of one night." "One night?" he repeated, the disbelief in his voice evident. "Sarah, this isn't just about one night. It's about every night since then. Every day I looked at you, believing in a version of you that doesn't exist. You weren't just lying to me about that night. You've been lying every day since then, pretending as if nothing happened." She bit back a sob, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Her face crumpled, and tears spilled over once more. Please, Daniel, I can't go back and change it, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Just please don't walk away. He exhaled sharply, looking at her as though seeing her for the first time. How am I supposed to believe that, Sarah? If I forgive this, what's stopping you from doing it again? How can I live with someone I can't trust? Her shoulders slumped. The realization settling in that words alone couldn't bridge the distance she had created. The silence between them grew louder, the gravity of her actions and the permanence of his pain stretching out like an unscalable wall. Give me a chance, she pleaded, her voice fragile, wavering. Let me prove it to you. I can change. I swear I'll make things right. But Daniel shook his head, his eyes dark and resolute. I don't know if I want you to. Maybe there are things that can't be fixed, no matter how much we want them to be. His voice softened, tinged with sorrow. I loved you, Sarah. I trusted you with everything I had. But now I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Her face fell, his words like a blade, cutting away the last hope she clung to. She had always imagined that if things ever got difficult between them, their love would be strong enough to carry them through. But now, seeing the cold resolve in his gaze, she knew she had crossed an irreversible line, one that left scars that might never heal. Is that really it, then? She whispered, her voice trembling. Are you saying it's over? Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He had loved her fiercely, trusted her with an unbreakable loyalty. But the betrayal had left a wound too deep to simply cover up and pretend didn't exist. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's left for us anymore. As he turned away, Sarah felt the full force of what she'd done, the finality of her actions sinking in. There was no going back. She had pushed him to the edge, and now, as he took a step toward the door, she saw that he might be ready to leave forever. Daniel walked to the door, his hand hovering over the knob, his back to Sarah. For a moment, he let himself imagine stepping outside, leaving the hurt, the lies, and the betrayal behind. It would be so easy to walk away, to let the cool night air clear his mind, and offer him a momentary escape from the weight bearing down on his shoulders. But something held him back, a tether of memories, shared promises, and the love he'd once cherished so deeply that it felt inseparable from his own heart. Please don't go, Sarah's voice broke the silence, fragile and pleading, piercing the air like a desperate call for mercy. Daniel, if you walk out now, I don't know what I'll do. I'm begging you. He hesitated, his hand lowering from the knob. Slowly, he turned back to face her, the faint glimmer of hope in her tear-streaked eyes stirring a strange, conflicted feeling within him. A part of him wanted to give in, to let her pull him back into the safety of familiarity. But another, stronger part reminded him of the pain he'd just been handed, the betrayal that now stood between them like a shadow cast over every memory, every promise they had made. How can you ask me to stay, Sarah? He said quietly, his voice edged with a mixture of frustration and sadness. After everything that's happened, after every lie, how can you possibly think things can just go back to the way they were? She swallowed, visibly struggling to gather her words, to find something, anything that might convince him to give her another chance. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, Daniel. I know I've broken your trust, and I know it might take time, maybe even forever, for you to forgive me. But I'll do whatever it takes to try. Just don't leave me like this. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, feeling the exhaustion that only emotional turmoil could bring. So what are you saying, Sarah? That you'll just keep apologizing, hoping one day I'll forget all of this? You're asking me to stay, but I need more than words. I need a reason to believe that this isn't just going to happen again. Because right now, all I feel is betrayal. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. She nodded, her expression shifting as she wrestled with her guilt and desperation. I know I can't undo what I did, but I can prove to you that it was a mistake I'll never make again. I'll be transparent, Daniel. I'll give you my passwords, my schedule, anything you need to feel secure. I'll even go to counseling if that's what it takes. I'll do anything. Daniel studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that her words were just another veil. But what he saw was raw vulnerability, a woman willing to lay her pride and privacy on the line to repair what she'd broken. The sincerity in her plea tugged at his heart, but his resolve wasn't softened so easily. You're asking me to stay in a marriage that now feels like a prison, where I have to play detective to feel safe. Do you even hear how wrong that sounds? He said, his tone soft but unyielding. You're offering transparency now, but you already had that option before. You didn't take it then. What makes this time different? Her shoulders slumped as his words sank in. Because I never realized what I was risking, she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. I didn't realize that my stupid mistake would cost me the one person who's ever truly loved me. He looked down, his face a mask of resignation. He wanted to believe her, to see the woman he had once known in her words. But the doubt was ever present, gnawing at him, whispering that the past could repeat itself. Yet, something inside him wasn't ready to give up, not completely. The part of him that loved her was still alive, still clinging to the fragments of what they'd built. "What if I give you one chance, Sarah?" he said slowly, each word measured. "One chance to show me that you mean it. Counseling, honesty, everything. But you need to understand that if there's even a hint of a lie, if there's any deception, I'm done. This is the last line for us."
She nodded vigorously, wiping her tears as hope lit up her face. "Yes, yes, of course. I'll do whatever it takes. I swear I'll be honest with you, Daniel. I'll work every day to rebuild what I've broken." He took a long, deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle within him. He wasn't sure if he was making the right choice or simply delaying the inevitable, but for now he was willing to give her this final chance. He stepped back into the room, the tension thick but softened by a fragile hope.
"Then let's start from here," he said, his voice steady, though his heart remained guarded. "But don't mistake this for forgiveness. This is the last chance for us, Sarah. Don't make me regret it." The days that followed were a slow, fragile dance between Daniel and Sarah, each step tentative and heavy with unresolved tension. They were still bound by their shared life, the morning routines, the meals eaten in silence, the mutual glances that conveyed unspoken thoughts. Yet every interaction felt different, shadowed by an unspoken fragility that made their home feel like a house of cards, one false move from collapse. Sarah threw herself into her promises with a fervor that bordered on desperation. She gave him access to her phone, her emails, even her social media. There were no more hidden notifications, no slyly turned screens, and every call was answered in his presence. She even insisted on attending marriage counseling, booking sessions weekly without fail, as if each appointment might bring them closer to a place of forgiveness and understanding. But for Daniel, none of it was as easy as he'd hoped it might be. He appreciated her efforts, yet they felt hollow, a series of gestures meant to atone for a past that couldn't be erased. His trust was still fractured, and every day he wrestled with doubt, haunted by flashes of that hotel charge and her tearful, last-ditch confessions. The memory played in his mind on an endless loop, a reminder of the man he'd been before, the trusting husband, the partner who believed love was enough. Their first counseling session was tense, filled with awkward silences and reluctant admissions. Sarah sat beside him, her posture tense, hands fidgeting with the edges of her sleeves. When the counselor gently probed into the reasons behind her actions, she broke down, her voice a mix of guilt and vulnerability as she tried to explain herself. It wasn't that I didn't love Daniel," she said, her voice breaking. "I just didn't realize what I was risking. I thought I could handle it on my own, that it wouldn't affect us. But I was wrong, and I see that now. I see the damage I've done." Daniel listened, his expression a stoic mask, but inside, her words stirred a complex mix of anger and sorrow. He wanted to believe that her regret was genuine, that her actions had been a mistake, not a revelation of a deeper flaw in their relationship. But trust was a stubborn thing. Once shattered, it refused to piece itself back together easily. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I want to believe you, Sarah. I want to believe that this was a one-time thing, that it didn't mean anything, and that we can somehow move past it. But it's hard to ignore the feeling that our marriage was built on something that wasn't real. I trusted you completely, and now I don't even know who you are." The counselor nodded, offering a gentle interjection. "Trust takes time to rebuild, Daniel. What Sarah did has hurt you deeply, and it's natural to feel unsure. The journey to healing isn't about erasing what happened, but learning to understand it, to find a way forward that acknowledges the pain but also creates space for growth." After the session, they walked to the car in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The counselor's words echoed in Daniel's mind, but the path to trust still seemed impossibly steep. Sarah reached for his hand as they drove, her fingers lacing through his tentatively, a silent gesture of apology and hope. He didn't pull away, but he didn't tighten his grip either, allowing her touch but keeping his heart guarded. At home, they began to share small moments again. She'd brush her hand over his shoulder as she passed by in the kitchen, or he'd ask her about her day, small talk that felt both familiar and foreign, as if they were two strangers learning each other's habits anew. Sarah poured herself into rekindling their connection, cooking his favorite meals, organizing the house with meticulous care, and spending evenings beside him, hoping for a spark of the comfort they once shared. Yet, for Daniel, the nights were the hardest. When they lay in bed, side by side but separated by an invisible chasm, he found himself staring at the ceiling, thoughts circling back to that night, the lies, the betrayal. The image of her at the hotel haunted him, a visceral reminder that the woman lying beside him had broken their trust. He'd lie there in the dark, listening to her soft, even breaths, and wonder if he'd ever truly find peace with her again. One night, unable to contain his turmoil any longer, he turned to her in the darkness. "Do you ever regret it, Sarah?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel. She turned to face him, her eyes glistening even in the low light. "Every day," she whispered, her voice thick with sincerity. "I regret it more than I can say. Daniel, I wish I could undo it, go back to the way things were. I wish you could see that." In that moment, he saw the depth of her remorse, the weight of her regret etched across her face. And though it didn't erase the hurt, it softened his heart just enough to let a flicker of hope break through the pain. For the first time since that fateful night, he let himself consider the possibility of forgiveness, not for her sake, but for his own. The days bled into weeks, each one a slow test of patience, honesty, and will. Daniel and Sarah were navigating a fragile path, one that often felt more like survival than healing. Yet amidst the awkward silences and tender attempts at reconnecting, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a gentle exchange here, a shared laugh there, as if they were rediscovering pieces of themselves they'd once taken for granted. One evening, after a particularly intense counseling session, they found themselves walking home in a quiet companionship. The air was crisp, the city lights reflecting in the puddles on the sidewalk, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't weighed down by the shadows of the past. Instead, there was a silence that felt almost peaceful. "Daniel," Sarah began, her voice soft and hesitant, "I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I'm grateful you've stayed. I can't imagine how hard this has been for you. I want you to know that I see your pain, and I want to be better for you." He looked over at her, catching the faint glisten of tears in her eyes. She was raw, vulnerable, and he could see how much she was trying, how much she'd changed in just a few short weeks. It was a change he'd never imagined he'd see in her, an openness that felt painfully sincere. It struck him that, for the first time, she was beginning to understand the depth of what she'd broken. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady but guarded. "I can see that you're making an effort, Sarah. I won't say it doesn't still hurt, because it does. But I'm starting to believe that maybe we can rebuild something from this." Her face softened, relief mingling with hope. "I know I don't deserve it," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the pavement. "But I'll work every day to be the wife you thought I was."
As they reached home, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him, a sense that perhaps they'd finally reached a turning point. They spent the evening in quiet companionship, sharing dinner without the usual underlying tension. When the conversation turned to lighter things, memories of vacations and inside jokes, he felt a warmth he hadn't felt in months, like a small flicker of what they'd once shared.
That night, as they lay side by side, Daniel found himself reaching out, his hand searching for hers beneath the covers. Sarah's fingers entwined with his, and he felt the warmth of her grip, tentative yet steady. They lay in silence, the simple contact speaking more than any words could. For the first time, he felt that maybe he didn't need to have all the answers right now. Healing, he realized, wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and perhaps they were both finally moving forward. In the weeks that followed, their life began to regain a sense of rhythm. The wounds were still there, scars that would never entirely fade, but they found solace in shared moments. They laughed more often, took walks together, and at times, let the silence between them speak of a comfort neither dared express. They began to share their thoughts more openly, bringing fears and insecurities into the light, rather than letting them fester in silence. Counseling continued to be a cornerstone of their rebuilding process. During one session, the counselor encouraged them to write letters to each other, expressing their fears, hopes, and dreams. Daniel found himself sitting up late one night, pen in hand, pouring out the raw pain, disappointment, and love he had felt for Sarah. By the time he finished, he realized that he was no longer writing from a place of anger, but rather from a desire to move forward, to let go of the hurt that had held him captive for so long. When they exchanged letters, Daniel's hands trembled slightly, but as he read Sarah's heartfelt words, her admissions, her regrets, her unguarded apology, a wave of release washed over him. She wasn't hiding anymore, she was bearing herself fully, letting him see her pain and shame without the usual walls of pride. The months that followed weren't easy. There were setbacks, moments of anger and doubt, nights when Daniel felt the sting of betrayal all over again. But each time they'd return to the foundation they were slowly rebuilding, the fragile trust they'd begun to nurture. And as time passed, he noticed that the ache in his heart wasn't as sharp, that his mind wasn't as clouded with suspicion. He started to let himself believe that perhaps people could change, that healing was indeed possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel turned to Sarah, his hand finding hers without hesitation. She looked at him, her expression filled with gratitude and a quiet hope. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, we have. Thank you for not giving up on us, Daniel." And in that moment, Daniel felt something shift, a peace he hadn't expected, a tentative but real acceptance. They still had a long road ahead, but they were on it together. And for now, that was enough.